as our friends at the IDA said, I'm Rachel Berger. I wear a few different hats, and she had mentioned that I am the founder and former executive director of Decoding Dyslexia Minnesota. In addition to that, I am also an education issues lobbyist down at the Capitol, and my work at Decoding Dyslexia Minnesota really helped me to learn all the things that I'm here to share with you today. And if it weren't for that organization, I would not have the level of knowledge I have to share with you. I'm also a mom of 3 boys who are 24, 20 tomorrow, and 17. One of my children has dyslexia, and I myself am an individual with dyslexia. So, like I said, lots of hats to wear here. But today we're going to talk about Minnesota's dyslexia laws, what schools and families need to know. Dr. Schulting was unable to be with us in person today, so she'll be joining me via a pre-recorded link that I'll share with you guys a few slides up. I apologize in advance that she's not able to be with us. She would have loved to be here, but sometimes things come up, and it might make things a little bit, we might cover things kind of twice a little bit, but we each have different perspectives, so bear with us on that. We're going to go ahead and get started. So today's presentation is going to start out with a history of dyslexia policies, scaffolding up to and the READ Act. Our Department of Education dyslexia specialist is going to take us into a deep dive on screening and interventions because they're particularly important to dyslexic students. Then she's going to hand things back over to me. We'll talk about advocacy, collaboration, and school partnerships, and I will also end things with a resource guide, different websites and different materials for you to utilize on your journey wherever you are with that. So I'd like to start out first by just kind of gauging who we are in this audience. If you're a parent, if you're here because you're a parent navigating a child through their K-12 experience, raise your hand, okay? If you're a teacher, okay, working in K-12, okay? And how familiar are you with the policies that we're going to discuss? What's your level of, okay, you're here for that, okay, got it. And if you're a tutor, please raise your hand. Okay, an individual from an organization, okay, got it. Okay, I just want to make sure, this is the first time I presented this content in this manner, so I want to make sure that you get out of it what you're looking for. I would also say that because we're a small group, I am okay with some questions. So I'm not going to have you hold your question to the end. I think that's a lot of working memory to hang on to as a neurodiverse individual myself. So raise your hand. I'll do what I can as I can. But we're going to go ahead and get started. So why is this topic important to us? Why does this matter right now? Well, there's a few things that lead up to that, and I like to call it a little bit of a trifecta. We have a lot more information on one second here. We have a lot more information right now about early literacy and the significance in having students read. Kindergarten to 3rd grade, they're learning to read. We now have data that supports that 3rd grade and beyond, if they're not able to read, they're going to have a very difficult time catching up to their peers. And so what I like to call this trifecta is that around about 2020, 2021, we had a few different things going on that led up to where we're at right now. And some of that is we had American Public Media reporter Emily Hanford, who had been covering dyslexia and literacy, started out with Sold a Story. So she shed a really big light on literacy and what was or wasn't happening within our educational environments at the time. In addition to that, we had a pandemic which really kind of, in my own personal words, lit the dumpster on fire in terms of what was happening. And then the other piece that had been happening leading up to the pandemic for a good decade was grassroots advocacy movements driving policy change, in particular on behalf of students with dyslexia. So again, that's the rising urgency around early literacy. I call it a trifecta, really. Dyslexia is an equity issue, as we know. This is a disability that's recognized by IDEA and ADA. It's a legit disability, and so that's an issue because we have students who can access a diagnosis, and we have those who cannot, and it becomes one of those haves and haves not. If you can access and pay for a diagnosis, chances are you probably have access to the resources that you need to support you. But that's an equity issue when the student sitting next to your child who has that access doesn't have the ability to do that, right? Statewide expectations here in Minnesota are now changing significantly with the passage of READ Act in 2023. And so now we have families and educators navigating new requirements and trying to learn at the same time. What does this mean to me as a teacher? What does this mean for me as a parent? And what does it mean to my child? So this is why this is a very timely topic. I am going to go backwards a little bit, though, and give you guys some history because what's led up to where we're at today and the READ Act wouldn't be possible had it not been grassroots advocacy organizations driving sweeping change. So I'm going to take you a little bit of history here and then we'll move forward again. So grassroots parents advocacy across the U.S. had been driving change for about a decade leading up to our passage of the READ Act. Reading instruction has been the focus of state and federal legislation for about 50 years. Amazing, right? But yet we were where we were. So reading and literacy rates were often framed as a public policy issue and the focal point of education reform. And yet we really didn't have an agreed upon path forward. Prior to 2013, there were very few states that had any dyslexia policy in statute. Grassroots parents groups such as Decoding Dyslexia started to organize and to drive policy forward. Currently, I just want to say something about Decoding Dyslexia Minnesota. I know we have two of their members here. Raise your hands. So 2013, 2013-ish, Minnesota became the 13th state in that movement. And in addition to Decoding Dyslexia driving a lot of policy priorities me helping to lead and Heather organizing with me, we also had a coalition of organizations. And I think it's really important to recognize that because here we're at the International Dyslexia Association Conference. So during my time at Decoding, we felt it very important to be part of a broader community that cared about individuals with dyslexia, that were working on equity issues and ensuring that these children had access to what our federal law says is free and appropriate public education. So that coalition includes Decoding Dyslexia Minnesota, Grove's Literacy Organization, the International Dyslexia Association Upper Midwest Branch, the Reading Center. Did I get them all? I think I got them all. And these are all organizations that are very much about supporting students' needs, whether it's ADD, dyslexia, and or some of the other learning disabilities. So I just wanted to mention that to you. Next slide here. By the numbers, dyslexia is now, so remember when I said prior to 2013, very few states had any policy. Right now, all 50 states in the US have dyslexia policy, We have 194 laws across the United States. So every single state has something on the books for dyslexic students at this point. A few years ago, that was not the case at all. So again, very prideful about this. I think we live in a really amazing state when it comes to these policies for students. And not just students, but the educators who work with them, because prior to that, dyslexia wasn't talked about really openly within our public education environment, well, public or private, within our education environments. It just was not something that people felt comfortable about. So let's talk about some of the milestones in Minnesota in particular. And I am going to have resources for you that'll outline these. So if you're a note taker and you like to take notes because that's the way you learn best, continue to do so. If you want to just enjoy the presentation knowing that I have follow-up resources for you, I will be providing those to you. So in 2015, we decided to put a cornerstone piece of policy in place, codifying or essentially legalizing dyslexia in the state of Minnesota. And some of you might wonder, like, why was that so important and so significant? Well, as I mentioned, prior to that, just saying the word within our educational environments was not possible. And as it was hard as a parent to say that word, to walk into a school and say, I have a diagnosis, to be met at the door and be told, well, we don't say that here. And our educators were struggling because they knew that the children had something else and they wanted to be able to talk about it as well. So that became our first piece. After that, we scaffolded it up, and I like to think of it a little bit like a sandwich approach. We had the cornerstone piece at the bottom with the definition, but we needed something higher up, and so we brought into pass the policy to have Dr. Schulting at the Department of Education as our dyslexia specialist. So she does a lot of great things. She works with districts, teachers, and families, and she serves as a primary source of information to support schools addressing the needs of dyslexic students. She also puts on trainings and professional development. She does a lot of amazing things. I'm not sure how she has the time for all of it, but we are very proud that here in Minnesota we have that role, and we are one of, I think, only 3 states that have a specialist within our State Department of Education. In 2017, we passed a higher education requirement. So this means that teacher prep programs are now required to include dyslexia in their teacher prep, preparation, in their work as we're preparing pre-service teachers. So they must have some level of dyslexia information as they go forward. And in 2019, really critical piece that was passed into statute was the screening bill. So annually, students are supposed to be screened for characteristics of dyslexia. Now in 2019, that was just an annual screening. Now with READ Act, it's a 3 times a year screening. So we actually got to improve a little bit. There was a lot of debate about this policy as we worked on this policy. It was a very hard one. In particular, individuals were worried that this policy was going to be diagnosing kids with dyslexia. Even though it's screening, there was a lot of concern that parents or teachers would then assume that's it, it's dyslexia, it's the only thing it can be. But characteristics of dyslexia doesn't necessarily have to be dyslexia. It can be that they're showing characteristics similar to, but they need a little bit more instructional support. And it's really good in terms of where we were at the time, working on these policies. It was so critical. So many of the educators that our students were working with, we weren't having children flagged until 3rd grade, and then all of a sudden now they're needing an IEP and a special ed eval and then an IEP, whereas we knew that if we screen them and identify earlier, if we match them interventions and services based upon those weaknesses, we can help them sooner and get what they really need before the what we used to call the wait to fail approach. Okay, two more big pieces I want to outline here. In 2021, we passed a $3 million pilot for Language Essentials, Teachers of Reading and Spelling, the letters bill. And most people don't know that we did that before the READ Act. But when we were working on policies, we knew that we wanted to have educators trained. We knew it was critical that all educators are trained in the science of reading. But that was a really big goal. And so we needed to, there were organizations that maybe weren't of the same mindset and felt that there was no way teachers were going to want to take 90 hours of training on the science of reading. No way. So as we got funding for a pilot, we learned very quickly, because the sign up for that pilot happened during Christmas break. And what educators are looking to sign up for training on Christmas break? I'm not sure. But within about 72 hours, it was 90% full. So we knew we were onto something. And the really wonderful thing about that was our dyslexia specialist at MDE and some others were kind of collecting data as those trainings happened. And the teachers union was working with us on that as well. And they were very impressed. They had so many teachers that, were saying like, this was a big aha moment. This is what why didn't I get this in college? And so we knew that we were going to need to train more educators. We just weren't certain how. And actually, it was rather unfortunate that in 2022 November elections, we lost our legislative champion, Senator Chamberlain. But then we had our House champion, Representative Heather Edelson, and we were able to pivot. She was ready to pick up the baton because she had been working with us. We were able to pivot and work with her directly on the continuation. And there were some very unique situations leading into that situation, or a session. We had a budget surplus that we were coming into, a huge budget surplus. And so what became, hey, I think we could probably only get $5 million for the next level up of training, to me being the person that I am saying, nah, we're going to ask for $90 million or we're not doing anything. And we got it. And we got it. Because all of those things, because it was one of those things that it was like, well, we're not going to just give some teachers access to this. That's not fair. That's a haves and have-nots. That's an equity issue. We are going to ensure that every teacher across the state of Minnesota can take this training. It's going to be paid for, and they're going to get a stipend for it. And that was critically important, and we were lucky enough to work with a very large work group of teachers union representatives, organizations that were both on the side of advocacy or working within policy to draft the READ Act and amend it 38 times, but ensure that we had what we needed so that we could create the massive change that we did. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of info. I realize in my timing here I'm longer than I'd like to be before I hand things over to Amy. So I'm going to do a little bit of backdrop in what READ Act has, and then Dr. Schulting is going to also cover a little bit of READ Act and that deep dive on screening. So there are many things within the READ Act. It is a huge bill. It replaces Read Well by third grade. This is the state's education bill. Reading to ensure academic development is what READ stands for. And the goal of this bill is to have every child reading at grade level, every grade they're at. So starts in kindergarten, and they strive to have children reading at grade level. Not waiting until third grade to then identify them and give them intervention and try to bring them up to speed. So the first thing that was critically important within the READ Act is professional development. Those of you that are educators, are you part of phase one professional development? Are you through the READ Act training? Okay, So phase 1 training had 34,000 teachers being trained at one time. And they could pick, I think it was, the selection was done by the district or the school, not per educator. One of 3 trainings that were aligned to the science of reading is what Minnesota determined. And so now we're in phase 2, which is only about 8,000 teachers across the state, and that should be done, wrapped up within the year. Curriculum is part of the READ Act. We are, asking districts to use very specific curriculums aligned to the state or to the science of reading, and MDE does a really good job on their website of determining which curriculums are aligned to they have a kind of a ranking system of what's aligned to the science of reading. We unfortunately no longer have funding for the curriculums. That changed in session 2024 because our schools needed more funding to implement READ Act in the stage that we were at. MDE has a lot of depth on the curriculum side of things, and they have a really great rubric that they created that helps people to understand what curriculums to use for what specific reasons and what scopes and sequences are within those curriculums. So some districts like to use a couple of different curriculums, not just one entirely. Screening, Dr. Schulting is going to take that in deep dive with it in just a minute here, but that is a very large part of our READ Act, and as I mentioned, that's being done 3 times a year now for kindergarten through grade 3, and then grades 4 to 12 is an additional piece now where they have, actually we're looking at passing that right now, but so 4 to 12 gets screened as well. But we're looking at some additional pieces around that grade 4 to 12, which don't look so solid this year at passing, depending on where we're at with things. We're also collecting data on students, on screening, local literacy plans, and in particular on students. So these are some things that are really amazing. What I wanted to point out before I hand over to Amy is that interventions are a big part of the READ Act, and just this year in this past year, November 2025, MDE determined which interventions are aligned to the science of reading and can be used as interventions within our schools for students that are struggling. Those are really important pieces. And literacy incentive aid has been tied to science of reading aligned materials, but literacy incentive aid last year went through a change, and now it is literacy aid. It's no longer an incentive, it is literacy aid, and that has changed from being funded by MCA scores to being funded by English language learner. So that the districts that weren't doing as well with literacy have a little bit more funding to help bring them up to where other districts are. So initially, literacy incentive aid started out as something to incentivize schools who were doing well. They would get more funding, and it was hopefully an incentive for other districts and schools to kind of follow what those guys were doing. So a little bit more equitable this way. And one of the additional pieces that READ Act has that I think are really important is our regional literacy network. This is now being overseen by MDE, and they are building capacity within there. Formerly, we had it wasn't named the Regional Literacy Network, but it was we called it the RCE, so Regional Centers of Excellence. And districts can go there for trainings and other items for professional developments. That's the way they had started out. But within the READ Act, we decided to really leverage those. So MDE is building capacity there for school districts through READ Act to receive coaching, ongoing professional development, and training, all specific to the READ Act. And so those are being fully built out right now and will be something that educators and districts have access to. Okay, I know that's a lot of information in a short amount of time. I am going to hop to Amy and let her do her part, and then we'll be back.
Hello there, thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Amy Schulting, and I'm the Dyslexia Specialist at the Minnesota Department of Education. And I'm sorry that I was not able to be there with you in person, but I'm thrilled you're here at our session today, and I'm so happy to collaborate with my friend and colleague, Rachel Berger. So today I'm going to talk about the Minnesota READ Act, specifically the literacy goal and with a focus on screening, the requirements, tools, and guidance, and specifically screening for characteristics of dyslexia and reporting on the local literacy plan at the end of the year. So let's jump into, first of all, the Minnesota READ Act requirements include screen, identify, and intervene with a focus on turning data into action. The literacy goal states that the legislature seeks to have every child reading at or above grade level every year beginning in kindergarten, and to support multilingual learners and students receiving special education services in achieving their individualized reading goals in order to meet grade level proficiency. So how do we accomplish this ambitious goal? So the READ Act requirements, as listed actually in statute, take you through the process needed to achieve this goal. The first step is to screen students, then identify their needs with the screening data, and then to intervene to address the identified needs, and also continue screening and providing evidence-based, high-quality core instruction for students at benchmark. Overall, the goal is to screen, identify, and intervene. And my colleague at MPEG, Susan Dowds, and I posted a recording of this, and we have a chant that we like to use, and we say screen, identify, intervene. So that's just another way to remember these important goals. So screening data is used to identify students who are at risk for reading difficulties, including characteristics of dyslexia. And again, a focus on prevention is essential. Screening provides a snapshot of a student's performance. It is not diagnostic, so further diagnostic assessments might be needed to identify specific instructional needs. Also, screening for characteristics of dyslexia is not a diagnosis of dyslexia. And most important, we screen so we can take action. Again, there's a strong focus on prevention, particularly in grades K to 3. As Torgerson, a very well-known researcher in the area of reading and literacy, once said, the best solution to the problem of reading failure is to allocate resources for early identification and prevention. And that's exactly what the READ Act is focused on. We're focused on prevention because it's more time efficient, cost effective, and most importantly leads to better outcomes for students. The goal of literacy screening is to identify student needs and address them immediately. Acting early helps prevent that ever-widening gap between students who have well-developed early literacy skills and those who have fallen behind. So let's talk about the specifics of screening implementation under the READ Act. So universal literacy and dyslexia screening in grades K to 3 states that each school district must screen every student in grades K to 3 using a screening tool approved by the Department of Education 3 times each school year. And that is first 6 weeks, by February 16th, and within the last 6 weeks of the school year. For grades 4 and above, including multilingual learners and students receiving special education services, again, they are included. For students who are not reading at grade level, they must be screened for difficulties, including characteristics of dyslexia, using the screening tool approved by the Department of Education, and must continue to receive evidence-based instruction, intervention, and progress monitoring until they achieve grade level proficiency. So let's talk about what are the approved tools, as that is a requirement that districts use a MPE-approved screening tool. In grades K to 3, there are 2 tools, DIBBLES and FastBridge. In grades 4 to 12, the tool that is currently approved There's one tool, and it is Capping Read Basics. Now, let's take a look at the screening implementation timeline. Last year, for the 2024-25 school year, in grades K to 3, universal and dyslexia screening was required using an approved tool. In grades 4 to 12, schools were advised to continue screening students in grades 4 to 12 as previously required since 2019, and that use of an approved tool was optional but recommended during this past school year. During the current school year, screening for characteristics of dyslexia using an approved screening tool is now required as of this year. In the 26-27 school year, we will begin with the implementation of oral language screening using DIBELS or FastBridge. And in grades K to 1, students will be screened universally in the fall using an approved tool, and beyond that, screening will be conducted as needed. So let's talk a little more specifically about universal and dyslexia screening in grades K to 3. As I'm sure you're all aware, the dyslexia definition has been in statute since 2015, and that definition is stated here. Now, there is a new definition that came out from the IDA this fall. It is not yet in statute, and it does go deeper in some aspects of the definition to clarify things a little bit more. However, the definition does not change the work that we are doing at the state or in school districts. So for purposes of today, the definition in statute is still absolutely an important guide to our work. And what we focus on is when we're talking about characteristics of dyslexia, we're talking about the bolded words here, which are difficulties with accurate or fluent recognition of words, and poor spelling and decoding abilities that typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of the language. So when we're talking about students in grades K through 3, they must be screened, including our multilingual learners and students receiving special education services and students enrolled in dual language immersion programs. Students must be universally screened for mastery of foundational reading skills, including those listed here, phonemic awareness, phonics and decoding, fluency, oral language, and for characteristics of dyslexia as measured by a screening tool approved by the Department of Education. So what are the skills that we are measuring in the required screening in grades K to 3? We are measuring phonological processing, specifically phoneme segmentation. We are measuring decoding or nonsense words, rapid automatized naming, which is measured through letter naming fluency, word reading accuracy and fluency, which is measured through an oral reading fluency test. And as I mentioned, the oral language screening will begin this coming year. Now, the names of the specific subtests are going to vary by grade and by screening tool, but all of those details are listed on the MPEG website if you would like a list of the specific screening subtests required in each grade and for each specific screening tool. You can find that information on the website. So again, as I mentioned, the primary goal is to use screening data to take action. And what we have done is, in order to support districts in interpreting the screening data in grades K to 3, we have created a tool. And so MPE does not require that schools administer all the subtests that would be needed to calculate the vendor composite score. So MPE has created what we're calling an MPE composite score. And there is a worksheet that is posted on the MPE website that schools and parents could use to enter student data to determine the level of concern that one should have regarding the results. So this allows schools to administer the required subtests in grades K to 3 and to determine if students are overall falling in green, which is a common color used to indicate that there is no concern or low concern with regard to reading difficulties. And then we also take that data in this worksheet or spreadsheet that we created for schools and for families, is we determine what level of risk for characteristics of dyslexia would the student be indicating. And given that in grades K to 3, all the subtests that we're using are measuring foundational reading skills. There's a very strong overlap between the subtests that are measuring overall reading skills in grades K to 3 and characteristics of dyslexia. So students who are not showing, who are showing low or no concern in reading difficulties are also going to be in green for characteristics of dyslexia with no indication of characteristics of dyslexia at this time. Students using the MPEG composite worksheet, if they're falling in yellow or red, which would show moderate or significant concern for reading difficulties, they would also be showing moderate or significant risk for characteristics of dyslexia based on that data. So here is an example of what the spreadsheet looks like. It's a very user-friendly composite score spreadsheet. And this one here is showing FastBridge kindergarten spreadsheet. And so basically, it looks like a lot of information, but most of it auto-populates. So the only information that needs to be entered is really what are the scores, or what's called the risk level for each of the subtests that a student completed. And then, after that student's performance is entered with an easy drop-down menu, then everything else calculates automatically. The MDE composite score would come up, along with the level of concern related to reading difficulties and general reading skills, and then the level of concern for characteristics of dyslexia, as well as the recommended action that is needed. Because again, our focus is really on not just collecting data for data's sake, or not just collecting data to submit to MDE at the end of the year with the local literacy plan, but really the goal of screening data is to take action quickly to identify student needs and provide the needed instruction. So for a student in yellow on this example here, the action needed is to monitor and intensify instruction. For this student, this is a FastBridge kindergarten example. And again, for this student, they are falling into that red category, showing significant levels of concern for reading with significant risk for characteristics of dyslexia. So the next step, or the action needed, would be to complete diagnostics and intervention. And diagnostics, just to clarify, in a school setting, diagnostics do not mean a diagnosis of dyslexia. It's really considered academic diagnostic tools. So for example, if a student is showing a decoding difficulty on the screen tool, a diagnostic would be a little bit more of a deeper dive to understand what are the specific decoding difficulties that a student is showing that could be addressed through instruction and intervention. Now let's take a look at screening guidance in grades 4 through 12. So as I said, this year in 25-26, we are focusing, we are implementing CAFE Read Basics, which is the approved and required tool for grades 4 through 12. This year, the focus is on screening for characteristics of dyslexia using 4 of the CAFE Read Basics subtests. And next year, schools will be screening with all 6 subtests to include the new requirement to screen for broader reading difficulties, including characteristics of dyslexia. So there are 2 options that schools currently can use to implement screening in these grades. Option A is a 2-step process where students may use a valid, reliable screener to identify students not reading at grade level who then need further screening with CAFE Read Basics. Option B is integrated screening. So districts who do not have a secondary literacy screener do not need to purchase one, or if the preference, really best practice recommended by NDE, is to universally screen students for reading difficulties using CAFE Read Basics at least once universally, and then to continue to screen those who are demonstrating difficulties on the CAFE Read Basics tool. Another avenue for screening would be parent or teacher requests. And MPE guidance is at the school, if a parent or teacher can request screening with CAFE Read Basics if they have concerns about student reading or characteristics of dyslexia in grades 4 to 12, and that all 6 subtests would be completed and the results would be provided to the person making that request. continuing on, it's important to note that in grades 4 through 12, that frequently used screening tools may not measure the same reading skills as CAFE Read Basics. We know that is true. Many tools are measuring broader skills in the higher grades, such as comprehension. So we know that some students may meet an oral reading fluency or comprehension benchmark in step 1 if schools are using that two-step process. However, these same students who met that benchmark may still be demonstrating decoding difficulties or falling behind expectations on CAFE Read Basics, falling below what we call the decoding threshold, and I will talk to you about that in a minute. So for this reason, again, schools are encouraged to consider screening all students at least once with CAFE Read Basics to identify students who are reading below the decoding threshold or struggling with decoding, as this data is typically not provided by many of the commonly used tools in the higher grades. So let's talk about what is this decoding threshold that I've mentioned. So researchers have identified what's called the decoding threshold, and this is included in the CAFE Read Basics tool. So what happens is the decoding threshold means that it is a level of, it's a threshold that can be measured with one of the subtests on CAFE Read Basics, specifically the first subtest, which is the word recognition and decoding subtest. So the decoding threshold is really a critical level of decoding skill that students must meet and surpass in order to achieve grade level comprehension. So students who are falling below the decoding threshold are not reading words and decoding well enough to learn efficiently from text. And for these students, demonstrating decoding difficulties becomes what we can think of as a bottleneck for the other reading skills. So they show significantly slower rates of growth in all areas of reading, including accuracy, fluency, developing vocabulary, understanding morphology, and of course comprehension. So the decoding threshold is actually a specific score of 235 on the CAFE Read Basics word recognition and decoding subtest. So for students scoring below this threshold, it is essential to prioritize decoding and phonics interventions to ensure that students make progress towards grade level proficiency. What we know is, again, if students are struggling across all areas of reading and is showing that their scores are below the decoding threshold, it is not recommended to start intervening on fluency or comprehension because they're not going to benefit from those interventions until they are at or above the decoding threshold, with the real goal of being above a score of 250. So for more details on the decoding threshold and the specific score expectations by grade level, I would recommend that you look at the CAFE Read Basics website. So let's talk a little bit more. We've mentioned the word recognition and decoding subtest and that decoding threshold for CAFE. Let's take a look now at the other subtests that are included. There are 6 CAFE Read Basics subtests. The first, as I mentioned, is word recognition and decoding. There's also vocabulary, morphology, sentence processing, reading efficiency, and reading comprehension. Now this year, 4 subtests are required. The first 3 as well as reading efficiency. And next year, all 6 will be required. And when we're talking about characteristics of dyslexia and screening for that in grades 4 through 12, we actually are just going to be looking at 2 of the subtests, those that are underlined here, word recognition and decoding, as well as reading efficiency. And so how do we interpret that data when it comes to screening for characteristics of dyslexia? If you look at this slide here, what we do is we look at these 2 subtests, word recognition and decoding and reading efficiency, and we look to see whether any of our students are in yellow or red on either of these subtests or potentially both of these subtests. And any students who are in yellow or red on either or both of these subtests would be flagged as likely demonstrating characteristics of dyslexia. However, as we'll discuss, best practice would also be to review and consider other data to determine if the student is demonstrating persistent difficulties consistent with characteristics of dyslexia. It's also important to note that parents or teachers, even without CAPI data, may see difficulties in the classroom that would indicate reading difficulties. So for example, if we see students whose verbal classroom responses are much higher compared to their written answers or their ability to read text, that would be a red flag. There are students demonstrating characteristics of dyslexia who may be able to understand content through lecture, class discussion, lab, or hands-on activities, and teachers can understand that they're learning very well, but then when the teacher looks at either how they're reading the text and understanding in their written answers, there's this gap. And so that would be a red flag for reading difficulties. Struggling readers also often need extra time to complete assignments and tests. We know that particularly with characteristics of dyslexia, it's very, very common to see spelling errors. There's long hours at home that parents may see doing homework. Again, students may demonstrate very strong content knowledge. They may have excellent math skills or strong understanding of science and social studies, but again, they may be struggling with that reading, writing, and spelling component in particular. And then we also know that characteristics of dyslexia have a strong social and emotional impact, particularly if these difficulties are persisting into the secondary grades. So that would be another consideration when we think about supporting our students. So these are students who may be demonstrating characteristics of dyslexia, and they likely did not receive that explicit, systematic, structured literacy instruction in the early grades to be able to read grade level text. So these students would absolutely benefit from screening with CAPI reading basics. So after this screening is done in grades K to 3 and 4 to 12, then what? As I said, the goal is to act immediately to identify student needs and to address them. And then there's also the statutory requirement for end-of-year data reporting on the local literacy plan. So before we jump into the actual reporting requirements, let's talk about the labels and terms specifically. So there are a number of terms that we've been using here. So risk for characteristics of dyslexia comes through a school screening. Again, we would not make a determination of whether or not a student has characteristics of dyslexia just at one time point. We would look for a pattern of difficulty, but there would be risk present even in one screening, and that's what that spreadsheet was illustrating. That was looking at risk for characteristics of dyslexia. Again, an important characteristic of dyslexia is that those difficulties persist. And so we do recommend that schools look at multiple data points or data over a couple of screening windows to determine if a student is demonstrating characteristics of dyslexia through a school screening. A specific learning disability is another term that you would hear. This is a label provided through a special education evaluation at the school site. And a diagnosis of dyslexia is different. It is called a specific learning disorder, again, or diagnosis of dyslexia, and this is provided by a licensed psychologist, typically a clinical psychologist or a neuropsychologist. To better understand these different labels, here's a visual that we created of these students across these categories. So this is not, just please note, this slide does not represent actual data, but it's really just a visual to show how these categories relate to each other and which category or categories a student may be in. So this visual shows that characteristics of dyslexia is a broad category. Particularly, a large number of students on the screening may show risk for characteristics of dyslexia. But then a smaller number of students will demonstrate persistent characteristics of dyslexia over time. And some of these students may also have a formal diagnosis of dyslexia from a licensed clinical or neuropsychologist. And then when we think of students with an IEP in special education, these students can cross all categories. A portion of students in this group with an IEP may be demonstrating characteristics of dyslexia, and some students, conversely, with an IEP may not have any reading difficulties at all. But that is why why we do collect screening data for students in education or in special education with IEPs so that we can better understand their needs. So with regard to end of the year reporting and parent notification, in statute there is a requirement that dyslexia screening and requirements are as follows. The data is to be included in the local literacy plan submission, which is due each year on June 15th to MPEG. And for dyslexia, it includes a summary of the district's efforts to screen for dyslexia, the number of students universally screened that year, the number demonstrating characteristics of dyslexia that year, and how students are provided with alternate instruction and interventions. Also, just a note that regarding parent notification, MDE's expectation is that families are notified if their child is included in the dyslexia screening count reported to MDE with the local literacy plan. As I mentioned, typically best practice would not be to just look at one data point. And because dyslexia is characterized by persistent reading difficulty that cannot be identified through a single screening, best practice is to use multiple data points to build a more complete understanding of a student's needs. So additional sources of data may include those listed here. Could be screening from other reading assessments or other CAPI Read Basics testing windows in the secondary grades or other screening windows for the earlier grades. Could be using diagnostic data such as a phonics screener. Could reflect family or student concerns or family or student history of difficulty, outside evaluation data, or a history of intervention and supports without significant progress. For multilingual learners and students in immersion programs, other additional data considerations are listed here. Again, family and student input, language of instruction, English language proficiency, literacy skills in the home language, and real and slight status. And for students in special education, all students, regardless of disability category, should be included in the dyslexia screening, the literacy and dyslexia screening. And characteristics of dyslexia are more likely among students in the high incidence disability categories listed here, if they are showing persistent foundational reading difficulties. And for students in low incidence disability categories, there's additional guidance on the MPE website. There's also, educators were also often asked and have asked over the years, can we state dyslexia? The question is yes. Again, we clarify, of course, that schools are not providing a diagnosis, but rather identifying characteristics of dyslexia. So to answer that question in more detail, I recorded a webinar with the wonderful Rachel Moeller, one of our state Compass regional literacy leads. And this website, or this webinar, is posted on the NDE website. And the topics that we include are listed here. So I do encourage you to go to the MPE website. There's a lot of resources that Rachel's going to talk about in a little bit more detail. But again, I do encourage you to take a look and to see what resources might be helpful. And in closing, again, I just want to thank you so much for being here today and for your attention to this topic and to your commitment to supporting struggling readers and those with characteristics of dyslexia. I will now hand it back to Rachel for a discussion on how to strengthen family-school partnerships. Thank you so much.
Okay. I'm going to skip ahead here. A lot of info being covered. I hope that it's not too overwhelming. So we've got only 5 minutes. We're running a little over. So I'm going to do things as quick as I can because I do believe someone has this room after me. So I'm going to have to adjust on the fly here. I only have 2 slides to cover, which is great. But I will say I'm going to spend my time here on strengthening school-family partnerships with the last 5 minutes. And then the resources that I'm going to give you or that I had intended to speak about are easy enough for me to include in links in this PowerPoint. So I'm going to go back into the PowerPoint. I'm going to add a slide with links and a little blurb for you guys so that we can just talk about the strengthening of school-family partnerships. I know some of you are tutors, parents, of children with dyslexia and also educators, and I think this is a critical piece for you. So what I want to talk to you about is how you can work together to create a system around a child who has dyslexia. And this is really critical and really important to increasing the outcomes for the student who is navigating their educational experience with dyslexia. No matter whether it's mild or profound, it is difficult for our students with dyslexia to feel that their learning environments are inclusive of them. And there are a whole host of comorbidities along with dyslexia that students commonly have, whether that's self-esteem and other mental health impacts. So it's important to collaborate, and it's important that parents and teachers have a positive relationship. I would say some do's and don'ts are do frame things in a partner mindset. If you're a parent, if you're a teacher, frame things in a mindset and approach them from a place of wanting to partner. I know better than anyone how difficult that can be when you feel like your child is not receiving what they need, and you want answers and you want to move things forward now. That is difficult. That is very, very difficult. But it's that old adage of attracting more bees with honey than vinegar. And if you've ever had a grandma that said that, you'll probably know what that is. So really think about how to leverage the individuals that are going to be around that table and center yourselves on the student. Needs drive the service. And so again, if you can think about things from a mindset of the needs the child has and being able to demonstrate what those are, that'll serve you. I want to just say a little bit about some don'ts, and in particular, because I may have learned those on my own, so let me share from my perspective. Anger, hostility, accusations, not going to really work. You know, it's just not the best way. I mean, if you have kids and or a partner in the home, you probably realize anger, hostility, and accusations don't work well there. Well, they're not going to work when it comes to trying to get things accomplished for your student either. So again, partnering, collaboration, some positivity, maybe framing things in a seeking, what do you call it, curiosity and seeking answers mindset. That will help the two of you to work together a little bit more. So questions to ask if you're navigating this space as a parent. You know, like back to what Amy was presenting with the screenings. This is a really easy inroad. Where is my child at? Or have they screened flagging characteristics of dyslexia? Are they mild? Are we in a wait and see, or are they, significant and we need interventions? So those are some questions. What are their present levels of achievement currently? Are we seeking interventions? Have they already had an intervention? And how was that intervention working for them? Was that successful? Where are we at with that? I think depending on where you are at with a student or a child you're helping within this, is it time for an evaluation? And by law, if you are needing an evaluation for your child, you need to put that into, you don't have to put it into writing, but put it into writing by law. The school district has to respond to that within 30 days, and whether they're going to do the evaluation or the reason for denying you the evaluation. And once that's done, it is, are we looking at an IEP or a 504? What kind of accommodations do we need? What, setting goals for the student. There's a whole lot of information within that, and I am going to point that out through this. So long before Decoding Dyslexia created these lovely binders that they have had generous donors step forward to help pay for so that you have access to these. I had one of these and navigated my way through IEP meetings with a binder. I found it was the best way to organize myself. Now, I also knew that I wasn't the most knowledgeable person in the room, but I intended to show up like I was. And it worked because they thought I was a lawyer, so I must have done something right. But organizing a variety of different things. And what do you want to include in that? Our friends at Decoding Dyslexia have created essentially what I walked around with, and they did a much better job than I did. So there's a lot of different tabs and things, but in particular, needs driving the services that the child gets. So I personally had examples of homework for my son and how he was doing. I also took it a step further because if we couldn't see that he was able, or if we could see that he was not able to write or spell and writing was massively difficult, well, then that's a need that drives some level of service, right? And if we were able to see and demonstrate that that wasn't progressing in the way that it was to his peers, that was a gap that we needed to close. In addition to that, I know one of the areas in particular for my child at the time was school was so difficult that during the weekend at church preschool, which is supposed to be fun, he was drawing pictures of being confused taking spelling tests. So, yeah, so, you know, again, collect samples that demonstrate how your child is doing navigating. He also had two things that we're going over, but I want to show you guys this. They also had these like self reporting that they did in school. You can't see all the way up here, but there's a whole lot of like frowny faces and kind of uncertain faces with relation to what he was doing. There was only one smiley face. I like to read a book of my choice. Thanks to his tutor, Heather Smythe, who taught him to read and give him the instruction he needed. One last thing that I think was really important in these binders that I did was I started to do a self-report and include these so that the quarterly IEP meetings, I had something. So this was today in school, and he could tell me anything he wanted about today in school. I felt, and usually it was something happened, and this is how he felt, and this is how he was coming home, and what we could do differently. Doing one of these things on our own and including this in this, bringing it with and talking about what he needed really helped me to be organized. It helped me to be able to demonstrate the needs so that they could then partner with us to determine how can we effectively help this student. So these are very important pieces for both educators and parent advocates, and I know we're over already, so all I would say to you is that if you haven't gotten one, grab one of these binders from Decoding Dyslexia downstairs. They're full of information, including info on our policies and in particular on READ Act. And so these again are made possible through generous donors. And they're available for to use. If you're a teacher and you're not navigating one of your own personal children, but you have a dyslexic child in your class, I would grab one of these for the parent of that child. So again, I'll update the slides. I apologize that we went over. This was a little bit different for us, having to bring someone in via pre-recorded, and it's just a lot of great content. I'll be downstairs if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer those. And look for the updated slides in your IDA registration stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.